The idea of this talk is to give you a virtual walk around his garden with his own words, because he did actually write his own guidebook, which is one of the reasons it was so great to work on. We also have poems that were written about his garden at the same time, like a long epic poem. But to give an introduction to him, we have this lovely portrait of him and his family, which is in the Wellcome collection, actually is on display just outside the library. So if you're ever in the Wellcome, do go and have a look. It's a beautiful painting. We don't really know who painted it, but it was painted in around 1786. And one of the things I love about this, apart from the fact that it is a beautiful painting, is that he is in his garden. It's relatively unusual. There's a few paintings of people in their gardens, but for someone like Lettsom, who's a professional, who is a medical physician, you wouldn't necessarily expect him to be outside. You'd normally expect to see him with like his books or his, other accoutrements of his trade, which I think demonstrates how important his garden was. Like, he really did see this as a key place in lots of different ways. And we have his wife there and his children. And there are interesting things about this portrait. I won't go into all of it, but one of the interesting things is the sun on his left to you, I was just trying to think about which way around that was, is holding a plant, as if he's been out botanizing and brought the plant back. The other sun in red is holding a telescope, and lets him just have an observatory in his garden, which I think, suggests an interest in astronomy, in plants, in science. This is, a scientific family. And then we also have those really interesting specimens of plants in expensive pots in the foreground, and quite a big glass house to the side of it. All of this says somebody who takes these things seriously. This is scientific gardening, and there's a lot of expense gone into the garden. It's not your average garden. So John Coakley Lettsom is born in 1744. He's a Quaker, which we'll come back to. It's quite important. I'll talk about where he was born a bit later, because that in itself is very interesting. But he purchased the land that becomes his garden at Grove Hill, which is the one depicted here in Camberwell, in 1779, which is around the time between these two items down here, which is lovely, like in between the two. And his guidebook that he produces is here. This is a second edition one. The first one is 1794. The fact there's two editions is interesting. I'm not sure it was ever for sale. I think maybe he just sent it out to people who were interested. Never been quite clear on exactly how it went. But just talking his letters about writing about his garden. And it's really helpful, because the idea was people in that, in an armchair gardening sense could navigate their way around it. So even if you couldn't get to it, you could read about his garden. But if you could get to it, you could also help walk around it. So if you arrived at Grove Hill in Camberwell, this was a great way of finding out what was there, how he was thinking, and what he was doing. We also have this illustrated long poem, the descriptive poem, which is all very positive about Lettsom, shall we say, and the way a lot of these poems were in this period. So people who are like, big landowners at somewhere like Stowe or Stourhead or any of those massive 18th century estates, or like Hagley in Worcestershire was really of interest as well. People wrote these long epic poems about them. It was like a whole part of an 18th century genre. So Lettsom, is a physician. He is top of his trade. By the time he has his garden and his house, he's one of the best paid physicians in London. And he's seeing himself, I think, somewhere between gentry and professional classes. There's an interesting thing going on there. The phrase a Quaker also has a special element to it. And we can see these things coming out in some of his work. But here's an image from his guidebook of the front of the house. I'll give you a sense of what it did look like. And a bit of the poem, which talks about Hygeia here in all her beauty blooms, enthroned with flora reigns mid rich perfumes, with skill Linnean ranged on Bez display brought from the regions of the rising day. So there's quite a lot going on in there, but that idea of Hygeia, of health, and that being a beautiful thing. There's a lot about Hygeia within the garden. Some of the statues relate to his medical profession. The idea of the rich perfumes, I like the sensory element to that. But then there's that skill. There's the idea that he's using Linnean methods of classification to lay out his beds, which was a pretty, you know, cutting edge scientific thing to be doing. And then the idea of things brought from the regions, the rising day. This is a global garden. These are plants coming back from other places around the world. It is, you know, a garden of empire. And if we look at how he introduces his guidebook, this is from sort of the introduction to it, there's an account of country houses and big seats basically on the road from London to Brighton. And the guy who does that includes Lettsom's garden in it, but Lettsom was one of the subscribers, so I don't know if he paid to have his garden like featured in it, quite possibly. He was seeing himself within that range. It's interesting relationship. But that idea that it was listed as somewhere that was interesting that you could go to, that people then started writing to him about it. And he says that, you know, applications were made for something about it from foreigners of taste and curiosity. So he's possibly also writing this for an audience outside Britain. And he says, to oblige and greatly, whom a few impressions are now separately printed. So, you know, he's written it for people so they can read about it. And he says it's for people who have country houses, but only small gardens. This is a very specific group of people. So people who are doing quite well, but they don't have, you know, one of the massive rural estates. And he talks about them laying them out in a style equally ornamental and productive. And this is partly, I think, his Quaker sentiments, but he really is interested in how you can do both things in a garden. And all the way through this is this idea of ornamental and productive running alongside. It's also on the outskirts of London. So this is partly because he can then get into London for his medical practice, but also has a rural retreat. And there's a few people in this kind of group that are in these areas around London. So John Hunter, who's the surgeon that the Royal College of Surgeons Hunterian collection is named after, that was his collection. He's in Earl's Court. Fothergill, who's another Dr. Quaker who we'll come back to, is where West Ham Park now is. So they're all kind of in these outskirts. They're sort of just outside the suburbs. It's not the area we think of for kind of rural estates. And then at the end, he talks about this idea of improvement for ornament as well as agricultural economy. This is a time of the agricultural kind of improvements, of agricultural revolution. And it is, again, a scientific interest. But to give you an idea of the scale of London and what we're looking at, this is a slightly later map. This is 1817, but it gives you an idea of what London's like in terms of its shape. What I don't have is a thing. I'll try and point over here. Camberwell is here. The city is in that red area there, and that's where his medical practice was. He was based right in the heart of the city. And he would walk in and out, which also seems like a very 18th century thing to be doing. And Camberwell, the house itself, is not actually on that plan. It just slightly falls off it at the bottom. It's kind of where that kind of red ruler is. It's just below there. But it gives you a sense of it being this kind of rural landscape. Camberwell was like Islington, a village, like Earl's Court. They were all like small villages that then become subsumed within London itself. And he talks about it being a healthy place to be. He said it's not the average place you would choose, but like there's good winds for, you know, healthy airs up on the hill. They're extensive and picturesque views. The fact they talk about there's like sailing and shipping, that idea of seeing commerce in the Thames, of seeing, you know, the empire in action is part of what he really is interested in. And actually the telegraph system in Deptford, which communicates with the Navy, turns up in some of the engravings that go with the poem. And it's actually in the poem about the area, about the kind of technology, that this is cutting edge, innovative. So although it's rural, it is part of this kind of mercantile shipping area, which of course in, you know, this late 18th century period was really important. That idea of combining naval grandeur and rural elegance. and that is, you know, the richest scenery. It's this kind of new picturesque in some ways. And he says that, you know, the evening scenery presents peculiar beauty, whilst the stars of the firmament form a canopy. The innumerable lights of the metropolis are extended beneath like a luminous carpet and pierce the darkness of night with glittering radiance. He sometimes gets quite like romantic in his language. And here we have a view that I took that's not great. I took it a while ago. I need to go back, actually. I got it out again and went, you really can't see that's a city in the background. I think that's mainly Canary Wharf that you can see from the hill looking down now. The gardens we'll come back to at the end, but you can go, and there's a community garden there. Padma knows all about this. And that tree, so I photographed this at the time. I thought this was really interesting. And when I was preparing this talk, which is the classic thing of like, you write a book, you don't look at it for a few years, you come back to it and go, oh yeah. And he actually writes about rendering fruit trees more ornamental by doing them in a circular form. And at the time when I looked at these trees, I was like, someone has done something to that tree. It has not grown like that naturally. That's someone. And I was trying to work out if it was one of Lettsom's trees. I don't know if it's old enough, but it is interesting that the way it is cut in that kind of form. I would quite like to get an kind of dendro person out to have a look at it with me, tree specialist. But that idea of, you know, doing things to give like air for sun, the kind of the health in the garden in terms of the trees and production is quite important. So he's also sharing horticultural things he's doing. So he wants to share, you know, things he's doing with the plants. And the fact that it's fruit trees will turn up a lot. I haven't worked out how many fruit trees there were, but there were a lot of fruit trees. And I think, again, it's because they were ornamental and productive at the same time. So you get the blossom and the fruit. That's all very lovely. Also, you know, you get a harvest and a crop from it. So I've said that, you know, there is this idea that he's written, you know, an account about it. It's been advertised. People could also turn up and visit it. So when Lettsom writes The Reverend Plumtree in 1800, and there's a picture of Lettsom as a fairly young man, it says, the Camberwell postman lives in my lodge that opens Grove Hill. He has the residence for the trouble of opening the gate. I am rarely there, as my professional duties oblige me to remain a denizen of the metropolis. And I have no idea about Lettsom's wife, really. So she does live there. They have children. And she does live at Grove Hill. So Lettsom actually writes to somebody at one point to say that the success of their marriage is he only sees her every 2 weeks at the weekends. And the absence, you know, is great for their marriage. I presume he's joking, but I'm not sure. But there is that idea that, you know, his place, you could go and visit it. You could turn up and you could be a garden visitor. 18th century garden visitor starts to become quite popular. And you've seen on that map, it's not that far outside London. So to get to, relatively straightforward. It's not like trying to get out to rural Gloucestershire or somewhere, which is still a bit of a challenge. And before that, like 10 years before, he'd already talked about the number of people coming to visit. So he says, you know, he has to work successively for weeks in London, prevents him from the accuracy of experiment, which ought to precede publicity. So he's experimenting with plants, but he can't do it the way he wants to do it. He says, because his villa is in the vicinity of London, numerous visitors ambulate my premises and beg or pluck up some of the objects for experiment. So the classic going round and picking up, you know, bits of plants to take home, which every garden owner will tell you is a problem, and some things don't change. The kind of, you know, that's an interesting thing. Can I just stick it in my pocket? And he's not the only one having lots of visitors. This is a great ticket. This is from Horace Walpole. Horace Walpole really complains about the number of people. He gets really fed up with how many people turn up looking for, you know, Strawberry Hill. So he starts doing these tickets. So 4 persons and no more. So you get like your time of when you can go. The house and garden are never shown in the evening, and persons decide not to bring children with them. And he does really complain about the noise of people going around. He gets no peace in his house because of all the visitors. So it's a lively time. Like, people are interested in gardens, they're interested in plants. We think garden visiting is a modern like conception. Stowe had already got a bell that you could ring at the back of the house from the back of the garden to go and visit the gardens with its own guidebook. And I think these are some of the things that people like Walpole and Lettsom are copying. And Lettsom's got this other idea, right, that people can learn about his garden, and it will be good for them. And this garden visiting seems to happen in lots of different places. And there are lots of unusual things when you start looking at what's happening. So the Chelsea Physic Garden is obviously the Society of Apothecaries Garden. It's for training the apothecaries. It's, you know, where they learn about the plants for medicine. It's a key place. But someone like Mrs. Delaney, now Mrs. Delaney is very well connected. She is friends with the King and Queen. She's making her beautiful mosaics at about this time, which are gorgeous in the British Museum, where she makes paper collages of flowers. If you've never seen them, botanically accurate and gorgeous. But she writes that, you know, she goes to the garden and returns loaded with the spoils from them. And I presume she was actually allowed to take them away. I don't think Mrs. Delaney was sticking them in her pocket, because she had like a tin, and I'm pretty sure she was invited in to look at what she found interesting. It says that her niece was surprised at the live chameleon she saw in the hothouse, which also makes me think there are these animals running around as well. And we'll see some more of those at Lettsom's. That coming in with all these exotic plants are these other exotic species. But she says that she travelled around with her niece. So she'd gone to Upton in Essex at Dr. Fothergill's garden, and she crammed my tin box with exotics, because Dr. Fothergill was properly plant collecting. He was spending money with Dr. Pitcairn in Islington, who was one of the heads of the Royal College of Physicians. They were sending out people to places like Africa to bring plants back. They were doing plant collecting, like funding plant collecting expeditions. And a lot of things were coming from America. So they had connections with the people collecting in the States, especially Quakers. Again, that whole Quaker network is really important for this. And then she also goes to Kennedy's plant nursery, which she says, you know, was a pleasant tour. And they went to Lee's at Hammersmith, but didn't find anything interesting. So for her, I think all of these spaces are interesting because of these new plants coming in. So Lettsom's garden is a greater place to go to as, say, Kew in this period, because all of these different things are coming in. And I don't think people are discriminating between the spaces. So the nursery is great because you get new plants. So's, you know, the doctor's garden who are collecting. So's, you know, the King's collection. There's just a real interest in the excitement of the newness. Now, one of the other brilliant things about Lettsom, he does do a plan with a key for his garden. So, you know, you can find your way around. And I'm going to give us a quick tour around this, and then we will go and travel around the garden in kind of a vague order. So the area at the front, where those pink buildings are, that's the house, the museum and the library, the greenhouse and the pot that are all together at the top pink bit there. And there's a house that he rents out as well. We haven't quite worked out the relationship with that, but he does rent a building out to somebody else as well. Then we have the orchard. Now, orchard is marked as K on here, and it's in two different places, but also, as we'll see later, there are fruit trees absolutely everywhere. They're not just in the orchard, which is also interesting. Then we've got the pleasure garden, which is this area here. Laid out in it. Not strictly a pleasure garden. It's more of a Linnean botanical collection, but he calls it his pleasure garden. And we also have the kitchen garden and the succession garden. Then we have the arbustrum, which is an interesting word, and I'll suddenly become quite interested in this. The Temple of Sybil, which is the observatory. We'll see all these things in detail later. The cold bath, which, you know, is great for your health, especially if you're of a Quaker persuasion. The reservoir, which I think is the water from Camberwell Springs, because the Camberwell is the well, and I think there was a stream that was running down it. I think the reservoir is to do with the water management. But there's also the fountain and cottage at the end. And he's obviously built up this garden where he's bought a strip along the side, right? This is the classic. Earl's Court is the same with Hunter. He kind of buys land over time. So you end up with these strips of land that he manages to purchase. Then we have the pond and statue of Cupid. So we have some things that are ornamental. Shakespeare's walk and statue. Shakespeare just had a big revival because of David Garrick. So it's quite unusual to have this. It's a relatively new bit of revival in English literature. So there's like a quick walk around. There's a lot going on in this space. So we will think about all of these bits, and I will give you a virtual tour. So you can pretend you're, you know, reading his guidebook, traveling around his garden. But to think about how he gets started comes from the link with botany. So this is from William Curtis's Flora Londoniensis, and we have three gentlemen out botanizing, dressed very well for it, I would say, if you're going to be going out and collecting plants off roadsides, and discussing them with each other. And that idea of thinking about plants, of knowing about plants, is incredibly important. And knowing about your local flora, so the Flora Londoniensis is the flora around London, and cataloguing all of that is just as important as exotic flora. And some of this, so William Curtis is an apothecary. He sets up the London Botanic Garden, which is encouraged and partly funded by Lettsom and Fothergill, which is how all of these networks go. It's because plants are essential to medical practice. They're still very much a thing. By this point, it's starting to shift so that apothecaries, who are kind of pharmacists, have more of the plant knowledge. And when you see doctors who are training in Edinburgh and the students complain about having to go and do botany, I mean, students will complain about anything. I mean, I know this to my peril. But they don't want to do it anymore because they don't really understand why it's that relevant. But they do say that they can't be, seen to not know as much as the apothecaries. There's always a bit of a one-upmanship in medical practice. So you want to make sure that you can talk to your apothecary and understand the plants. And Lettsom, when he comes over to Britain, which we'll come on to, starts out as an apothecary's apprentice in Settle. So he starts out being an apothecary. But in terms of his background, he isn't born in Britain. He's born in Tortola, which is one of the Virgin Islands. And this is a Quaker slave plantation. So he comes from very much that part of the empire. He comes over when he's 6, so he's not there for very long. He goes to a school run by Dr. Fothergill, and Dr. Fothergill becomes kind of his mentor in Britain. And I think some of that excitement about plants and interest in plants comes from Fothergill. He doesn't have that much money, is my feeling, which is why he starts to be an apothecary's apprentice. And I say this because he goes back to Tortola when his father dies and he inherits a slave plantation. And I think he is 23, in 1767. And he releases all the slaves. He does not want to have a slave plantation. But he still makes a lot of money out there. So I think he must have been treating slaves and probably plantation owners while he's out there. And he comes back a lot better off. And then he goes and does his medical degree. So he finishes his medical degree in Leiden. So there's a really interesting history to all of this. And I'm fascinated by these bird drawings that I found out very little about. He does them when he's 13, so he's already over here. He's presumably copying them from a book, but they're very much exotic birds that you might have seen, I think, in the West Indies. And I found out nothing about this. If anyone knows anything about these, I am very interested. But you can see his artistic temperament and his interest in the natural world is already set off quite young. And when he's learning to be an apothecary, the description of him in the biography that Pettigrew writes is that he could be found, out in Settle collecting all these plants in Yorkshire and cataloguing them and building up his own herbarium. So he was already doing that at, the age of 19 at a relatively young age. But then he comes back, he goes and does his medical degree at Leiden. And the way you got your medical degree was to write a dissertation. So dissertation was always key. He wrote his dissertation on the tea plant, which is very exciting because the letter to Linnaeus there is about his dissertation. It's the year he's finished it. He's obviously very pleased with his dissertation. And the tea tree was a pretty new plant. It only flowers in London round about the time that around the time that Lettsom writes his dissertation. He goes to see it. I want to say it's Lord Burlington, but I might be wrong on who has the tea plant. But that idea of tea for health and how it could be used is already part of this. But it shows that even his medical practice interest has plants like running through it. He's somebody who has a really deep interest in the scientific knowledge around plants. And that is a beautiful engraving coloured by Miller, which is absolutely gorgeous. So if we come back to his garden, In the pleasure garden, he has his European plants divided into 24 beds, each containing one distinct class of Linnaeus and every order in each class. And I think it's Pettigrew who says if you went around and read the labels and had a botanic book with you, you could learn from his garden. So it is that kind of collection that you would normally think of seeing in a university collection at this point. So like Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Glasgow, or Chelsea Physic Garden, which is an interesting outlier in all of those. There aren't that many other places in Britain where you could go and look at a botanic collection. And I think these doctors, particularly Lettsom, is building up a way of learning about themselves, but also sharing that knowledge with other people. He's very keen on sharing knowledge. So he says the whole compartment is capable of admitting only 500 plants, which still seems like quite a lot to me, but to him, not as great. So each genus could not be included. The American division comprises about 300 species. There's a lot of plants coming across from the Americas, and that is to do with the connections in the States at this point, with the plants coming back. He then talks about the beds surrounding it are ornamented with flowering shrubs and plants, and the espaliers which divide the two compartments are not only furnished with trained fruit trees, but also there are standard fruit trees, which is why I say there are so many fruit trees in this garden. Like every section seems to have fruit trees. And he says, where house possess no greater extent of land than this pleasure garden, the present arrangement seems well calculated to unite also that of a kitchen garden, so that you could do all of it together. So again, he's thinking about people with smaller amounts of space, but how you could basically have a kitchen garden and a pleasure garden all together and not lose anything. It would still look beautiful, which kind of feels like the ornamental kind of kitchen garden idea. And that is all marked K on there. And again, he talks about surrounded with a brick wall covered in fruit trees. So there's fruit trees all over the place. And I love this drawing of the back of the house. So you can see the size of the glass house running along the side. I think the pleasure garden must be slightly beyond where the viewpoint is taken from, but where all those interesting sort of shrubs and trees start appearing. We've got a family in the garden. I think it might be Lettsom's family, but I don't know. We've got a gardener hard at work. There's interesting plants in there. And this is all in his horticultural sketch as well. So he has these beautiful illustrations of his own garden to give you a sense of it. So he talks about these fruit trees, sort of like being terminated by a greenhouse, which I think, if we go back actually, is that one there, which is 50 feet in length. There's also a library, which we'll come back to. And this idea of the ornamented shrubbery. And again, he talks about the beauty being things like orange, lemon, other exotic trees. So again, the beauty is partly the production. The production in itself has beauty. And I think that's at kind of at the heart of how he thinks about what a garden should do. And I've said he was friends with John Fothergill, or John Fothergill was rather his mentor. So Fothergill himself has an enormous number of plants at Upton House, which is now West Ham Park. And when he dies, Lettsom purchases 2,000 botanic specimens to put in his own garden. So there's kind of that interesting network of moving plants between spaces, of friendship, of memorial, of not wanting to lose these collections. And that kind of scientific understanding not being lost. And again, we've got exotic birds on here. And I think there's a lot more exotic animals and birds that aren't in menageries that are just wandering around gardens. We tend to think of the menagerie as a place where they all are, but a lot of the time they are just in the garden itself. So the kitchen garden, which runs alongside the pleasure garden, has a stove house, has a hot house, has the conservatory. Again, like there are all these glass doors and various bits of it. And the reason I talk about the kitchen garden is to do with these guys. So he has tortoises amongst many of the animals he has. I think he has like an eagle. There are various other animals he has at different points. But the tortoises, he writes I've become so familiar as to attend regularly the gardeners at their meals and eat the leaves they offer from their hands because they're wandering around the vegetable garden, which feels like a risky option. But I guess if they're being fed, they're probably not going to destroy your plants too much. And he says when Humphrey Marshall of Westchester, North America was a boy, he caught this tortoise and marked it in such a manner as to enable him to identify it afterwards. These animals, which are of slow motion, seldom travel far from their native soil, and scarcely a year elapsed without his recognizing this individual for the space of 63 years after it had been thus marked. H. Marshall sent it as a present to the proprietor of Grove Hill. This was about 8 years ago. So this little quadruped is upwards of 70 years old. And one of the really interesting things about Marshall sending that to him is that the kitchen garden, we have the succession garden, which is again, an added element of the kitchen garden, really. The succession garden communicates with the arbustrum. And I think the arbustrum is the walk that runs around the outside. So you say it's about a mile in extent, so it's got to be the walk that goes around the outside, carried under the shade of above 100 choice fruit trees. So again, we've got fruit trees. Between each fruit tree are currants, gooseberries, beds of strawberries. And the word arbustrum is really interesting. The word arboretum isn't really used till the beginning of the 19th century, really. It's kind of a really late word that comes into being. And arbustrum is used in Henry Marshall's American Grove, which is about the American trees that he was growing over there. So I think there's a really clear connection between the American trees, his links with Marshall, the Bartrams, who are the Quakers over there doing the plant collecting, sending things back to him. And then within his arbustrum, which I'm pretty sure is a play on the kind of, arbors and trees, he has larches, laurels, forest trees, and then things like the American cherry, the Siberian apple, the filbert, the barberry, and then other things that unite ornament, mangel weasel, rutabaga, rhubarb. Rhubarb is a real interest in terms of growing medicinal rhubarb. And again, it's variety and it's to afford a succession throughout the year. But mangel wurzel was a real interest to him. So he received the seed in 1769 and he gets it via the Royal Academy of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. And the seeds are sent to him to trial. And he writes to a lot of people about this, saying that he thinks they could feed a lot of people with it. So in fact, it's called root of scarcity. It's because grain prices are really high. And the idea is that something like mangel wurzel would be great for feeding poorer people who are really struggling. In the end, it only really ever gets used for pigs. I think it's still used as like pig feed and sheep feed now. But it's kind of somewhere between, there's a lot of debate about this, some kind of turnip, beetroot, root vegetable. So he translates the account from the Abbé de Camberwell, so the French version. He doesn't put his own name on it, interestingly, which I think is partly the Quaker not wanting to have his association with it. Like, he doesn't need to have his name recognized, but he does note throughout it his own trial and error that he's been doing. So it's very much his own edited account. And one of the reasons he's so interested in these kinds of things is partly the agricultural improvements. There's a lovely image of the White House at Kew. It was King George III's place, showing the kind of pastoral idyll. Of course, Farmer George is his name because he writes about agricultural things he's doing himself. So there's kind of that trend, that fashion, and I think Lettsom's kind of aping that to some extent. But he really does have concerns over poverty and health. Because he's a Quaker doctor, he visits people in the East End of London. He writes his hints and directions, of which a lot are about ways to help people. On the left-hand side is one of his soup kitchen designs. And he has a recipe for Camberwell soup and various other soups that are kind of cheap soups to produce. There's an image on the other side from his book about visiting poor people at home. Because he was a Quaker, he went around and visited people in their houses in the East End. And he saw poverty like up close and saw how it related to health and disease. And I think some of these issues can be seen in the way he thinks about the agricultural improvements that are necessary and who they can help. He also sets up the dispensary, which is kind of an outpatients for people who can't afford or get tickets to go to other medical practitioners or hospital. He also has an interest in bees, so his Hints for Promoting a Bee Society is a lovely title of a book. I'm not sure that his beehives looked as rustic and as beautiful as they are in that diagram with St. Paul's in the background. That feels like that's very much artistic license. But he says he has 64 hives, which is an enormous amount of beehives. And they're all distinguished by the name of some kingdom or independent nation, which is a very interesting way of thinking about organisation and nationhood and the role of worker bees and queen bees and society and all those things that people in the early modern period were interested in. But he also talks about how people could have beehives in their window frames. So you could watch the bees being all, you know, active and running good societies, but also you get honey for your breakfast really easily. Now, he never says this is about sugar production and slavery. And he talks about it being a cheap and productive thing to do. He talks about the decline of bees in London, which is fascinating given this is an ongoing issue. He's already talking about this at the end of the 18th century. But that idea of, production and interest, but also who else could use it. He's not saying everyone has to have 64 beehives. He's saying you could do these things with it. And bees are of real interest. So John Hunter's last paper before he dies is about the experiments he was doing at Earl's Court on beekeeping, where he had glass hives, where he could mark what was happening with the bees. And he could watch them. And he has this great account, it's the last thing he publishes in Royal Society Transactions, where he talks about trying to work out the sound of bees, where he kind of pulls the leg off a bee, try and work out where the sound comes from, puts it in water, the bee gets peeved. And he tries to see how they could make this noise. And then he talks about when they swarm, they make the same noise, a particular note on the piano, which makes me think he heard them swarm and then went to play the piano to try and work out what that was. And he said Hunter described his head as being like a beehive. So that idea of bees and production of honey in cities, I think or on the outskirts of cities, is very interesting. And then if we travel around again from the arbustrum, so we're kind of walking around the garden, we get to the circular temple or observatory, which is based on the Temple of the Sibyls, he says, at Tivoli. And he has all of these cork models. He also has the scientific instruments of James Ferguson, who's one of the people who writes his writes in favour and join the Royal Society. I forgot what that's called now. There's one just there for Lettsom here, but that kind of recommendation for being a member. So there's a whole relationship with them. And he has like these scientific instruments in there. He has these cork things. People would come and visit him on a Saturday, other doctors, and come and see these collections. And he has this kind of very rustic garden building. So he kind of makes it into the classic rustic garden building, but it's a scientific building, which again is how these things are interlinking. So he describes it becoming more picturesque and rural because it has honeysuckle growing up it. It's in a grove of trees. And of course, again, it's like a really fashionable thing to be interested in. So there's a Thomas Rowlandson of 1810, which is one of his satirical prints about people being fashionably into stargazing in Oxford. And this is around the same time as there's the interest in the transit of Venus. The king has his observatory at Richmond. Again, there's that sense of having a small estate that kind of apes these other practices. But again, it's a place of science. It's a place of knowledge. It's not just a place of pleasure. And it is also a place of health for him. So he talks about having his cold bath, which he jumps into, which was seen as a way of strengthening the body. It's quite a common feature in the 18th century garden, sort of plunge pools and cold baths, often from a really cold spring, so as cold as you can get it, and jump into it to kind of boost your body. But again, he talks about it as a picturesque object. So a lot of this is about how things are like functional and beautiful at the same time. But that idea of the garden doing more than just one thing, of it being medicinally useful in all kinds of ways, I think is very interesting. And then at the end of the walk, we get to the fountain and cottage, which again has these kind of rustic pillars. It's kind of one of these rustic buildings at the end of the garden with a big fountain and a pleasure like boat to go and look at it. So there is a sense of pleasure running alongside these things, which is evidenced in that. And he does have parties. He has doctors around quite a lot. He has a very good cellar, according to James Boswell, who would know, because he comes around on a fair bit. And in 1804, he has this big party with 800 invited guests, where he has strawberries still growing on the living plants, ice creams of every sort of flavour, rich jellies, confectionery of the most ingenious devices, many of the articles enclosing well-adapted poses, with the more substantial dishes of ham, veal, beef, etc., etc. In short, such an abundance of every delicacy has left nothing either to be wished or desired. And he has a specially constructed pavilion with fully grown orange trees, so they appear to support the roof over the diners. I mean, it sounds fabulous. A big garden party with all these lovely things. Of course, there was no gambling, and I don't think there was any music either, because he is a Quaker. He does have a cellar, so he's not, you know, too far down that thing. But he did make everyone go through the museum and library on the way out, because they had to go and look at his collections. And the library and museum occupied the western wing of the house. The bookcases, there are 39 feet in length and 20 in breadth, with 16 compartments. There are names over all the different bits of various people. Newton, I think, is on there. I can't think of else at this point, but there's a variety of people. And the library opens by a glass door into the garden through the greenhouse, and by another door into the museum or repository for natural history and other curiosities. He has a collection of medals in there. He has interest in those. He also has quite a few corals. And I love this image of him as some kind of classical figure, that he is, you know, in his classical library in the style of Virgil and the Georgics, which I don't think is accidental. And that's within the poem. All these engravings are part of the poem. So he has this collection that he builds up. And I'm not entirely clear what happens, but by the end of his, or getting towards the end of his life, so only 1 year after he has this enormous party, which is about the time his daughter gets married, so I think this is all probably related, he was complaining that it was right wore down with fatigue, and that Grove Hill was so inundated with visitors that it resembled a hotel. So he was like, too many people are now coming round. But by 1811, he was having to sell things. So he was selling his collection, he's selling his libraries. The library takes 6 days to sell. I mean, it's a lot of books he had collected. Partly why he went bankrupt might be the amount he spent on his collections. He was always collecting plants. He's obviously got all his shells. He's got, you know, his medals. He's got his books. It's not a cheap occupation. In fact, John Hunter also dies relatively penniless. His wife has to go back to teaching after his death. So there's something very interesting about how they build up the masses to do this, and then also end up without anything. And then he has to sell his villa before he dies. And he actually dies in Sandbrook Court, which is where his practice is run out of, and that's where his London home is. He also re-inherits a slave plantation on his deathbed from one of his other relatives, which I can't imagine he was massively pleased about, given all things he'd gone to, which kind of shows how people's lives were totally entwined with these things, whether you wanted them to be or not. They were part of everyone's lives at this point. The house is demolished in the 1890s. So there is that bit of ground around it that's now still there, because the house went, and it happens with Hunters as well. It's that kind of thing about suburban London, really. Houses don't necessarily stay. They're not the kind of houses you would always think about keeping. So our reminiscences, like the way we can think about his garden, are very much based on his own words and his own description of it, how other people wrote about it. We can get a sense of the kind of place it was. But sadly, you know, without time machines, there isn't a way of revisiting it in full. So a couple of the other illustrations, we have, I think that's Hygeia and the Fates at the top left. These are the telegraphs, which are seen as picturesque and technological innovations. And then on the right-hand side, that's the image of Shakespeare's statue. Now, I do think these images are probably not entirely accurate. That one of Lettsom and also the beehives, I think, suggest that. They're quite romanticized images. But again, it does give us like a slight way into thinking about what they found interesting, the things that he thought he should have in his garden, this idea of culture, of science, of pleasure, all combining in one space. And that idea that you're part of these broader networks of interests, that he can write to people and send them seeds. You know, you get these connections with all kinds of people doing that. He can write to Linnaeus and say, I've written, you know, this dissertation on tea that I think is interesting, that presumably Linnaeus responded to. Do we know? He probably got too many letters, didn't they? Lettsom just tried again, going, maybe I'll try again with something else. Yeah. But that sense of wanting to be part of that scientific network and actually having an introduction into all kinds of other, you know, spaces and people. And their plants were sent all over the place. So Edinburgh Botanic Garden would have plants and seeds sent up to it from these other doctors' gardens that they were collecting for the nation in some ways. And duplicates were really popular, right? Because you could then share them and swap them. We often think about this time period being around the places like Kew, but actually there are all these smaller gardens that are more domestic spaces that are also doing similar things. I'm going to sort of finish there. I put up his Naturalist and Traveller's Companion with the Camberwell butterfly in it, which I think suggests his interest in home, that Camberwell was really important to him to use that. But this is all about collecting insects to bring back, other natural history, also medals. There's some things about spring water in there. It's kind of like a guide to traveling around the empire and how you might bring the empire back. If you'd like to know more, there is a book. I will say, because the Wellcome Trust funded it, it's also free to download on the internet. So do feel free to do that. And if you have any questions, I will try and answer them. But thank you very much for listening.